Thank you very much. Let me add my voice to those who've thanked Professor Menashri and the Center for Iranian Studies. It's a privilege to be here for this special occasion, and it's particularly interesting for me as a non-proliferation expert in a room full of Iran experts. I think the value added for me has probably been more than for many of the rest of you. That also, though, signals the perspective from which I approach this issue. I'm a so-called arms control wonk, and I have been immersed in the Iran nuclear crisis more or less since its beginnings. And the basis for many of my thoughts and speculations derives not only from following the issue at a minute level of detail over these last 6 or 7 years, but also from participation in a couple of rather intensive Track 2 exercises that have given me extensive exposure to Iranian colleagues, multiple visits to Tehran, and the opportunity actually to set foot in a number of the Iranian nuclear facilities. There is, in my assigned domain here of U.S.-Iran diplomacy and the prospects for it, a wider canvas that I'm not going to touch on except to put out there as a marker, and that is Iran may end up playing a role, and potentially a central role, in the evolution of American policy toward both Iraq and what's increasingly called AFPAC. And indeed, there's speculation in Washington that in the early deliberations of the Obama administration, that there's at least one group that's coming to the conclusion that Iranian help may be even necessary, but certainly helpful in allowing the United States to come to grips with the mess that we find ourselves in Southwest Asia. Among the non-proliferators in Washington, there's even the concern that some of the non-proliferation issues may get short shrift out of a concern that we need so badly Iran's help in dealing effectively with the Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan contingencies. This is a dimension of the regional context that cuts the opposite direction from Emily's arguments yesterday that there's pressure on Iran. The flip side is that Iran has some advantages in the regional context insofar as Washington concludes that it needs Iran's help. But I'm going to zero in and try to focus narrowly on the nuclear diplomacy. Parsimonious explanation for that is that this is what I know the best. So let me try to offer you some thoughts in that area. I'll try to cover a lot of ground and sketch it out very telegraphically. Many of these points deserve more elaboration than I am able to give them. And to think about where Obama may go in dealing with this nuclear crisis, which started in August of 2002 and at the present moment shows no signs of terminating, you have to understand a little bit about where we are and how we got here. And I think that the fundamental proposition to begin with is American policy towards the Iranian nuclear program over the last 15 years has simply failed. Both Clinton and Bush made strenuous efforts to stop it. Neither of them succeeded. As we've heard from earlier sessions, today Iran has thousands of deployed centrifuges. It has a fully functioning uranium conversion facility. It has produced hundreds of tons of uranium hexafluoride, which is the feedstock for the enrichment plant at Natanz. It has produced in excess of 1,000 kilograms of 4% low-enriched uranium. This is reactor fuel, not nuclear weapons material, but it is, if further enriched, the very stuff that would enable them to make a weapon. So our principal goal with respect to nuclear diplomacy was to prevent Iran from having a centrifuge enrichment capability, and today Iran has a centrifuge enrichment capability. Not as much of one as they plan to have in the future, but today they have proven that they can do it. Well, what was this failed policy, if the policy failed? And the answer is both Clinton and Bush, and Bush more intensively than Clinton, pursued a policy aimed at isolating, pressuring, coercing, and disrupting Iran. And this started very much in the Clinton years. Clinton actually is the one who formally declared U.S. policy to be regime change. The Clinton administration, those of you who know the history will know, successfully disrupted one Iranian nuclear deal after another, including notable ones with the Russians and the Chinese. A lot of effort was spent trying to prevent Iran from even getting a start on the sensitive fuel cycle programs which we now are so concerned about. But by 2001, those programs the construction had commenced. Bush, of course, tried even harder and was inclined to be even tougher towards Iran, and we had a policy that included an explicit commitment to regime change as a basic objective of American policy. There was the military encirclement of Iran, byproduct and part of our interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also deployments in Central Asia. There was open debate in Washington about the desirability and wisdom of attacking Iran. There was persistent, relentless effort to achieve the maximum possible sanctions. As time goes on, we find evidence seeping out now about sustained programs to sabotage Iranian commerce, particularly nuclear commerce. There have been reports in the past several weeks of a $400 million a year campaign of covert operations aimed at destabilizing the Iranian regime. There are published reports of cross-border raids by small American units from Kurdistan into Iranian territory. There's been the explicit campaign of the State Department, $100+ million a year, intended for broadcasts in support of opposition groups and so on, intended to try and produce political movement in our direction in Iran. There was the support of the MEK, which is on even the State Department's list of official terrorist groups, and of course a relentless effort to isolate Iran diplomatically. And you saw this particularly in the Gulf diplomacy of the Bush administration, efforts to go and try and fashion a kind of coalition of the willing to isolate Iran. And I think one has to accept that for the Bush administration, this policy, the focus on Iran, was not an afterthought. It did get overshadowed by Iraq and so on, but this was a high priority. Lots of effort was put into it. Very high-level people were assigned to it. Those people, Nick Burns in particular, I have high regard for and think are very competent people. But if you ask, where are we now? What's the effect of this? And I think the answer is, Iran is riding high. We spent much of yesterday hearing of our collective worries about Iranian hegemony in the region. In the nuclear area, when George Bush became president on January 20th, 2001, Natanz, I believe, was literally a hole in the ground, and Isfahan, the uranium conversion facility, was a construction site. Today it's a functioning enrichment program. And of course, the ultimate aim of this was to topple the regime. And while I think you could argue that maybe some damage was done, ultimately the broad judgment I would say is that the grip on power for the regime does not appear to have been mortally weakened. Punchline, our policy didn't work. And we gave it a good long run, 8 years and more. So now we have a new president, and this new president comes to office thinking that maybe there are grounds for trying a different approach. And of course, he was, during the campaign, openly committed to a different approach, that approach being one of engagement. The one issue is whether this approach is even available. And I understand from some of you in the crowd that President Ahmadinejad made a comment today saying that he would talk to Americans about everything except the nuclear program. If this is the position, we're not going to get very far with these nuclear negotiations. This is, in fact, however, simply a restatement of a an Iranian position of at least a couple years standing, in which they argued that the nuclear question was a technical matter which really existed in its relations with the IAEA, and that the United States was a kind of extraneous player to it. This is their response to America's effort to put our nose into their nuclear business. But in addition, there are conclusions that one often runs into from the history of the past 7 years that might lead one to think that Obama's alternative is a false alternative. And I'd like to touch very quickly upon those and suggest just a thought for each about why it may be that there's room for more hope than you might think. One proposition that you hear a lot is that Iran is simply unresponsive to Western concerns and priorities, and that they won't really be very forthcoming. Well, in the early days of the nuclear crisis, one of the shocking things was that Iran was amazingly accommodating. They were asked to negotiate with the Europeans, and they negotiated with the Europeans. They were asked to sign up to the subsidiary agreements with the IAEA, which would oblige them to provide significant additional information about their facilities early in the construction cycle. They did that in 2003. They were asked to sign the additional protocol. They signed the additional protocol in December of 2003. They were asked to immediately implement the additional protocol even in advance of ratification, which they did, somewhat without precedent. They were asked to suspend their enrichment program, and this they did not once but twice, so that in the period between October of 2003 and January of 2006, for almost that entire period, Iran's program was in a somewhat suspended state. Now, those of you who follow this know that what does suspension mean became itself another bone of contention, and the West and the EU took a more expansive view, and the Iranians took a narrower view, but they did nevertheless suspend some of their nuclear activities in response to outside requests. And then, in addition, the IAEA requested and Iran agreed to negotiate what were known as additional transparency measures that went beyond the normal safeguards agreement and beyond the additional protocol, which gives the IAEA further rights of inspection. And Iran accepted some additional transparency measures that, for example, gave the IAEA some limited rights of inspection of Iranian nuclear facilities. This is something, for example, the United States of America has never done, allow an international organization to inspect our sensitive facilities. So this was in a different period, under a different president, with a different context, and so we can't know whether this kind of experience is replicable, but what one can see is that at one point, Iran was fairly responsive. Another proposition you run into fairly commonly is the Europeans prove that diplomacy will be fruitless and futile. We heard this yesterday from my warm friend, Therese Delpech. Maybe that's true, but it also has to be pointed out that the Europeans were extremely ineffective mediators between Washington and Iran. And I don't have time to unpack that, but the very short version would be to say the Europeans promised Washington they could deliver the Iranians. They promised Tehran they could deliver the Americans, and it turned out they had the capability to deliver neither. And the result was they earned great distrust in Washington, where you often heard the word pathetic in relation to the European diplomatic efforts. And they earned anger and contempt and a sense of betrayal in Tehran, which felt that the Europeans were lying to Washington about what might be possible with Tehran because they feared Washington's impulse towards force. So maybe the Europeans told us something definitive about the prospects for diplomacy, but maybe not. There's an argument, and I know it's an argument that is offered by some people in this room, that we've already offered everything Iran could possibly want, particularly in the three big offers that were made to them over the course of the Western diplomacy, and that the rejection of these offers is definitive proof of Iran's disinterest in diplomacy. Here you have to look carefully at what was actually put forward, because what the West did in the two EU3 offers and then the big June 2006 P5+1 offer, is put forward something that was not really an offer. It was an agenda. They were under headings like possible topics for potential future talks with Iran. There was not a single pocketable concession in any of those three documents. And so the crucial judgment for the Iranians turned out to be, if you suspend your enrichment program, what do you think you will get when you actually sit down to talk to the West about this laundry list of topics they're prepared to discuss with you? And it wasn't that long into the Bush administration when the Iranians had a quite clear sense of what the answer was. They expected to get nothing from the Bush administration. Zip. That was their expectation, because they understood, as the Bush administration frequently articulated, that the commitment was deeply to regime change. And they realized that the Bush administration was not eager to do anything that would assist the regime in prolonging its rule. So, from the Iranian point of view, and I've gone into this in great detail with Iranian diplomats in Tehran, they were never offered anything. There was never a real concession out there they could reach out and grab. They thought it was all a big public relations stunt that was part of the American campaign to manage our allies in such a way that they could get, the Americans could get diplomacy, get sanctions through the UN. There's also a proposition that says, for a whole variety of reasons, especially having to do with identity and the theocracy and so on, that Iran simply will never be interested in a deal with the West. And you all will be a better judge of that than I, and it may turn out to be true. But I have to say, or at least point out, that to understand the history up to now, what you have to realize is that what we've seen so far is much more explained by the fact that the Bush administration was not interested in a deal. I don't think the Bush administration was ever seriously interested in a deal. The story becomes more complex the last 2 years or so because the administration began to divide. Condi Rice and Nick Burns, I think, were pursuing a more flexible line. But the office of the vice president, which was very powerful, never deviated. Vice President Cheney famously said at one point, which you hear from Iranians as often as we talk about President Ahmadinejad's various unfortunate statements. When asked about negotiation with Iran, Vice President Cheney said, "We don't negotiate with evil, we destroy it." Well, for the Iranians, this was a modest clue as to the sentiments, and those who work closely with President Bush, in my experience, what they say is he believed what he said about Iran, that its evil nature, the unacceptability of its polity, the undesirability of doing business with them. That for him this was not rhetoric; it was something in his heart that he believed in his bones. So maybe the Iranians don't want to deal, but in the past period we had an American government that didn't want to deal, and I think that if we give it a shot, maybe we get a better result. And then there's a question of the final point I'd make in this heading here is the issue of pressure. And Emily Landau raised this, I thought, very effectively yesterday. What is going to be the role of pressure in managing this situation? And there's a sense that if we could just find a way to squeeze a little more pressure on Iran, that we could find our way to a solution, that they would finally give way. And there are 2 points I would draw your attention to. The first is the Bush administration was not holding back. They were going for everything they could get. They put huge amounts of diplomatic energy at the very highest levels in trying to wring every possible sanction out of the collective community that was required for sanctions to be at all meaningful. And what we see is what they achieved. So barring some dramatic change that really provides a kind of smoking gun of Iranian ill intent, it's hard to see how we do much better. In the abstract, as we heard this morning, Professor Rivlin, you can imagine types of sanctions that might bring Iran to their knees. But we have not been remotely close to achieving those sorts of sanctions. But then the second thing is, how did Iran respond to pressure? And I think the history so far is very clear, which is in response to pressure for whatever reasons, domestic political constraints, national pride, and so on. You folks are the experts on Iran. The Iranians responded not with concessions, but with resistance, not with compromises, but with retaliation. And you can see, I can just give you one small vignette, which is when we got into the sanctions game, each effort to escalate the sanctions was met in Iran with a substantial retreat from the very elaborate transparency regime which had been constructed in the period 2003-2004. All those good things I talked about in the beginning about Iran being responsive, one by one were stripped away to the point where today we live only with the basic comprehensive safeguards agreement that governs Iran's declared nuclear facilities. They're no longer allowing the additional protocol to be implemented. They're no longer observing the agreed statements 3.1. They're no longer allowing additional transparency measures to be instituted. So as we pushed harder and harder, they retreated from us. And so I think what that implies is that we've got to think very carefully about the circumstances in which sanctions will be helpful to us and pressures will be constructive, and those in which they make our job harder. I have no abstract objection to pressure, but when it doesn't work, maybe it's time to try something else. So to my eye, it's not self-evident that more pressure is the solution to our problems, nor do I think it's really true to say that diplomacy has been tried and failed. Well, I'm very short on time, so I'll just try to quickly sketch where I think Obama is going to have to come to grips with some hard choices. Paolo and I agreed to a division of labor in which he would sketch out some of the things that he thinks might be offered to Iran that might work. We all understand that this is an experiment, and we all understand, everybody who's dealt with Iran, all the diplomats that you talk to will agree that they're very, very difficult negotiating partners. So no one's claiming this is certain to be successful or easy, only that it may be worth attempting and that it can't possibly be any worse than the policies of the last 15 years. At any rate, Obama, I think, in the first instance, is going to have to ask, what are the objectives of our nuclear policy? For a decade or so, we've been sitting on the position that the only acceptable outcome is zero enrichment in Iran. That's a maximum goal. It's a desirable goal. I'm a non-proliferator. That's by far my preferred outcome. But the critical judgment is, do you think it's feasible? There's often a tension between the desirable and the feasible. And if you think that it's not feasible, it very much changes the way you think about the unfolding diplomacy. Much harder, it's easy to define maximum goals, no nuclear in Iran of any sort, or no enrichment. Those would all be wonderful in my eyes. But much harder is to define minimum goals. That is to say, if we have to live with some nuclear capability in Iran, what are we prepared to live with? Where's that line? Is there a line? And so let me offer quickly a couple of principles and a few measures that might be helpful to us on the condition that zero enrichment is probably not possible, and that we're going to have to figure out what we're capable of living with. I think, A, we want to be able to try to cap Iran's centrifuge capability as low as possible. They've offered this in the past. We rejected it because it involved greater than zero. But it is possible to imagine a verified limit on the number of centrifuges. The real goal in Iran, as desirable as zero enrichment is, the real goal is no bomb. No bomb. That's the big enchilada. So I think if they have capability, then we want as many political, legal, technical, and institutional barriers between Iran's nuclear capabilities and a bomb. And there are a lot of ways that one can interpose. None of them fundamentally solve the problem, but all of them give us some protection. We want to maximize transparency, and I think we want to maximize our warning of breakout. That is to say, if Iran were to decide to use the technology on its territory for a bomb purpose, we want to know early, immediately. Well, there are a whole family of measures. I don't have time to go through them all. The minimum would be ratifying the additional protocol, accepting subsidiary agreement 3.1, and restoring the additional transparency measures. I would think that would, from our point of view, be the bare minimum. That would give you a fairly intrusive ability to inspect their capabilities. But there are others. Continuous IAEA presence. This is not unprecedented. The Japanese do this. The Iranians have said at various points they would be willing to discuss it. Verifiable caps on production of uranium hexafluoride, the feedstock for enrichment, or low-enriched uranium. Continuous monitoring of material flows. This is now technically possible. It requires a political decision so that you can keep tabs of the material that's flowing through their systems on a continuous basis. A commitment to permanent real-time material accountancy. So you don't balance the books once a year, but you do it once a week, so that diversions get detected essentially immediately. Permanent perpetuation of short notice inspections. When you have IAEA inspectors on Iran's territory continuously, they can do 2-hour short notice inspections of facilities where it's very hard for the other side to do big time hiding and cheating, and so on and so forth. These kinds of measures provide transparency and warning. So it would be very hard, close to impossible in many contexts, for Iran to move in the direction of a weapon without the world knowing very early, like close to immediately. And then we would still have the problem of figuring out what the hell to do about it, but at least we would know. So if the choice is between 0 and not 0, then I choose 0. But if the real choice is between a more constrained Iranian program and an unconstrained Iranian program, then personally I choose a more constrained program. Now, I think that one of the big shifts that we may be seeing in the move from Bush to Obama is the move off of 0 centrifuges, because we've been trying that one for the better part of a decade, and the result is thousands of Iranian centrifuges and no diplomatic progress. And it's hard to believe that the Iranians are going to roll back to 0 all the investment they've put in the capability they now have. How to achieve a desirable outcome? There's only 3 possibilities. Force, which is a time buyer but an expensive one. Isolation and sanctions, which is basically the game we've been playing. And engagement and inducement. And basically I would say that the contrast, or the transition from Bush to Obama involves a shift from sanctions with force as a highly visible fallback to Obama's posture of engagement and inducements with sanctions as the highly visible fallback, and with force more retreated into the background. But what's necessary if you're going to try and make the diplomatic track work are 2 broad things. And I'm not going to talk about any of the details because I don't have time and because Paolo is going to cover it. But the first is you've got to be willing to pay. And I know that in the United States, we've never really stepped up to this question of what truly are we prepared to pay. The only thing we were prepared to do was negotiate with our European allies to come up with a laundry list of things we were prepared to talk about. That's a totally different exercise from what are we really going to put on the table when the moment comes. And ladies and gentlemen, the price is going to be high, right? Firstly, because our own extreme reactions to the Iranian nuclear program have driven the price up. They know how badly we want to stop this program. But in addition, they've invested very heavily, both economically and politically, in this program. And in addition, it may take a big payday for the domestic politics of this issue to work out in Iran. Again, you're the experts, not I. But they're not going to have an easy time of going home with a minuscule victory. It's going to take something big. And the second thing is, we've got to really be prepared to put on the table pocketable concessions, not vague promises of things we might do. Here I would draw your attention to the contrast with how we dealt with the North Koreans. Not that that one worked out so well. But the agreed framework of 1994 took the form of phased symmetrical concessions. And the agreement said if you do A, you get B. If B is completed, then if you do C, you get D. So there were pocketable concessions where if the North Koreans completed their obligation, they would actually get some payoff, like annual deliveries of fuel oil. And the truth is that between 1994 and 2001, the agreed framework froze the plutonium program. The fuel rods were in a cooling pond. They were tagged and sealed. They were under continuous IAEA surveillance. There was regular IAEA supervision. And there was no progress toward a bomb. It was when we confronted them over an alleged uranium program, a completely different route to nuclear weapons, that the deal fell apart, and the North Koreans then went on their merry way to get a bomb. And as we all have noticed this morning, they're still working on it. So it did work for quite a while. And if you compare this to, say, the military option, where what you might get is, 5 or 6 or 8 years of delay, if you could take out their choke point technologies, that bought 7 or 8 years, the agreed framework. And it came to an end because of our behavior, not theirs. Well, let me then conclude with just some thoughts about, well, this is all fine and dandy, but is the Obama administration really going to be able to do this, and is this really likely to succeed? On the question of whether this will be sufficient, I think that the honest answer is we can't know. The Iranian behavior has been rather opaque. There are straws in the wind that cut this way and straws in the wind that cut the other way. There are lots of rhetorical statements that sound very unpromising out of Tehran. When you meet privately with them, they're often much more forthcoming. But the point is that our policy up to now is failing, and it seems to me that the objective we want to achieve is crucial. And therefore, we ought to try and struggle to see if some other way might work. If it doesn't work, you can still fall back to sanctions, and this is exactly the logic that Obama has pursued. But there are impediments to obstacles, not simply the deep suspicion and distrust that's in both directions. In Washington, we have an administration that's distracted. Lots of other things on their plate, the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. We have an administration that I think on the Iran issue may be divided. It's got some very tough-minded characters that have been appointed to high positions, and it may be that there's internal dispute. Any kind of significant concessions to Iran will involve a large role for Congress, which is reflexively in an Iran-bashing mode, and I don't think it will be at all easy to get this through Congress. And we have also the problem that right now we have our transition, so half or more of the relevant jobs are still unfilled in Washington. Meanwhile, everything has been in a kind of limbo because of the Iranian election, however it comes out, so we've lost a lot of time. This is a situation where time is not our ally. With each passing week and month, the Iranian capability is both bigger and, more importantly, better. They've learned a lot, and that's not good. So I'm going to close here and just say that it's quite possible, and what I fear in my heart is that we're on the road to learning how to deter a nuclear-armed Iran. This is what's happened in the past when we've dealt with hostile proliferators. I'm going to stop now. I won't need my 2 minutes. But it does seem to me worth a genuine concerted effort to make diplomacy work, not because it's highly likely to succeed, but because the alternatives have either failed or are unpleasant. So with that, I'll leave it to Paolo to confuse you further.